First Timothy chapter 6. How about it? Last chapter in Paul's letter to Timothy. Sometimes it's easy to get so, okay, maybe not for you, but for me, I can easily get so focused in on a tree, I forget the forest, right? And in this whole thing with First Timothy, the forest is Paul is offering everything from pretty solid direct commands to advice to urges, and beyond that, some really street level organizational kinds of ideas for Timothy. Remember, Timothy is in Ephesus, and if you study Ephesus at all, and obviously Paul wrote a letter to the church at Ephesus, the book of Ephesians that we have, but the city of Ephesus it's a very interesting study. And the value of studying Ephesus has to do with its cultural context. And I've talked a ton about that. I'm really committed to the idea that if we can, wherever and whenever we can, get a clearer cultural, historical context in mind for the scripture we study, the better we can interpret what is there. And I've already talked to Gob about basically the ancient world, people's perception of time. I've talked about how sunrise to sundown, that was a day. Only the wealthy could afford to light their homes with lamps and oil lamps, particularly, so that they could, do stuff in the dark at night. Well, anyway, okay, there's lots of things about ancient culture. And when you look at Ephesus, a culture that religiously was built around the worship of Aphrodite, Diana. You set Timothy down in that religious, cultural context, and you realize he's got some pretty sizable challenges. And one of the challenges, and this is one I believe that we don't really understand this in our culture. It was a challenge of slavery, slaves and slaveholders. I did some research on this and discovered that fully 1/3 of the Roman Empire were slaves. That's a huge number. And historically, many of those who came to Christ and were in the church were slaves. It wasn't exclusively so, but wherever, when the church at Ephesus gathered, I don't know that it's a 1-to-1 ratio, but the odds favor the possibility that 1 in 3 of those people were slaves. So it has to be addressed. Now, believe it or not, and most people don't want to believe it, even I didn't really want to believe it, but the fact is that today there are more human slaves than there have ever been up to this point in time. If you add all the let me back up, I misspoke. If you add up all the slave trade from in the 300 years of slavery in the Americas, there are fewer of those added total than there are today human slaves in the world. It's bizarre. And thankfully in America, there is not I don't even know the best way to say it, but we don't have a visible presence of slavery. But I'm afraid the visible aspect doesn't make slavery go away. Here, in America, one of the most egregious social ills, in my opinion, is the sex trafficking. You don't see it. We don't. But my goodness, is it ever there? We live in the Oklahoma City area, and if you look at a map, Oklahoma City is a primary location for the sex slave industry as a hub for receiving and sending these. It's primarily young women, girls, ages 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and some older, but they are lured and then they are enslaved and trafficked. I have a very high level of admiration for Tim Tebow, partly because he has stood in the spotlight ever since he won the Heisman Trophy. And many, I would even say most of the sports commentators have no regard for him. They think it was just a fluke, that he was a no talent winner. Well, say what you want to say about his performance in college and his performance in the NFL and whatever, but you know what? He stood with integrity through the whole thing, and there was not a time in that where he wasn't a target, didn't have a target on his chest. Well, that's one reason I have high regard for him. Second thing is, when we were at Canyon Ridge Christian Church in Las Vegas, our church invited Tim, and he came and did a weekend with us, and he's the real deal. How the way he was on stage is the way he is off stage. He is a what you see is what you get kind of guy. And now his life's mission is to eradicate the sex trafficking and in America and abroad. He's putting his money where his mouth is, and he's bringing his influence to bear on this modern slave trade. Now, in other parts of the world, there are slaves, millions actually, of slaves that are labor slaves, right? Add to that the fact that there are another set of millions of sex slaves. So I guess the point I'm trying to make, I could have made in one sentence. We still have slavery. Is slavery okay? I'm not going to make a judgment on that, but I will. Let's look at what Paul writes to Timothy regarding slaves and slave owners. 1 Timothy 6:1. All who are under the yoke of slavery, See, people became slaves in several different ways. One is, well, two basic ways. One is against their will. The other is by their will. Okay, against their will, there were gobs and gobs of slaves that were born into slavery. Their parents were slaves. When they were born, they became property of their parents' master. That's the thing about slavery in the ancient world, is that slaves were treated as items, not people. I suppose when I'm thinking of the sex slavery and the industry that is there, several $billion a year, these are basically not there under their will. They are, and they are basically treated as things, not people. Okay. So you could be born into slavery. You could have been, pardon me, my nose is going to run down my sinuses. Many of the slaves, probably most of the slaves in the Roman world, had been taken captive in battle, in wars, and subjugated to be bought and sold as slaves. Then there is a second way, which for me, it's hard to imagine doing this, but it happened routinely in the Roman world, where a person would become a bond servant, a bond slave, meaning they would choose to make themselves a slave to another person. It could have been in order to satisfy a debt that they didn't have resources for. Believe it or not, it could have been because there was just admiration for the person that they connected themselves with, obligated themselves to as a bond servant. This was by their own choosing. Paul talks about himself as a bond servant of Christ. And most of us, we totally miss the implication of that. Well, slaves in Timothy and Paul's day a lot of them were in the church, all who are under the yoke of slavery. The yoke, that is a full-on ancient agricultural word picture. You do know that before, the invention of mechanical power, all the heavy agricultural work was done with oxen or cows. In ancient times, not so much horses or even mules, but oxen in a yoke. And Paul says there are people, if you're under the yoke of slavery, meaning you're there. For now, anyway, in the moment, you're there. Don't pretend you're not. But he says, consider your masters worthy of full respect. Now, I'm looking at that and thinking that could have been really hard. It wouldn't have been difficult if your master had been respectable. If your master deserved respect, then that's not hard. But what if your master truly treated you like a thing, not a person? They didn't have regard for you. They just used you. And if you were going to get used up, they'd throw you away and start with another one. What then? Well, Paul says, you should consider your masters worthy of full respect. Full respect is, don't jump past the implication of this. It's not like, show them some respect. We're not talking about some respect. We're talking about full respect. Oh, all of a sudden, it gets very difficult. You and I are not slaves, but most of us have a boss that we're working. And I wonder if the principle applies to us. Consider your boss worthy of full respect. And then he goes on to say why. This is not about because that's what culture calls for, or you'll make it easier on yourself if you do this. Nah. So that God's name and our teaching may not be slandered. Boy, I'm so ready for this to be over. So that God's name and our teaching may not be slandered. Got to come back to it. I've run over time. I'll see you next time on So Care with Stevie Boy.